The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue over the busy downtown streets. It was just another day for most people, the hurried rhythm of life carrying on as usual. But for Mike, a former U.S. Army veteran, today was another battle in a different kind of war. Sitting quietly on the edge of a park bench, Mike clutched his faded backpack, the only possession he had left in the world. His weary eyes scanned the faces of passers-by, some of whom offered sympathetic glances, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Life hadn't been kind to Mike lately, but his spirit remained unbroken. Unbeknownst to Mike, across the street, someone else was watching him too. Her name was Karen. To the outside world, Karen appeared like an average suburban mom, the type who lived for book clubs, PTA meetings, and neighborhood gossip. But Karen had a way of finding problems where none existed, and today, her sharp gaze landed squarely on Mike. She whispered to her friend, gesturing dramatically toward him. "I'm calling the police." "He shouldn't be here," Karen said, her voice tinged with a mix of disdain and self-righteousness. "People like him make the neighborhood unsafe." Her friend looked uncomfortable but didn't protest. Karen pulled out her phone and began dialing, her voice growing louder for everyone around to hear. "Yes, officer. There's a suspicious man loitering near the park. He looks dangerous." Dangerous? Mike was about as far from dangerous as anyone could get. A kind-hearted soul who had once served his country with honor, he now found himself misunderstood and overlooked by the society he had fought to protect. But Karen wasn't interested in understanding. To her, he didn't belong. The sound of approaching sirens broke through the ambient noise of the city, turning heads and drawing curious onlookers. Karen stood tall, a smug expression on her face, certain she had done the right thing. Mike, however, remained seated, his expression calm yet cautious. He had been through worse than this and knew better than to panic. Still, his heart raced. Encounters with the police could go in any direction, and he'd learned long ago that life didn't always play fair. The patrol car pulled up to the curb, and two officers stepped out. They were a study in contrasts. One older, with a face weathered by years of experience, and the other younger, carrying himself with the eager energy of someone still new to the job. As they approached, Karen wasted no time inserting herself into the situation. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she began, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "I've seen him here for days, and it's making everyone uncomfortable. Who knows what he's planning?" The older officer raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He glanced at Mike, then back at Karen. "Ma'am, can you point out what exactly he's doing that's threatening?" Karen faltered for a moment, clearly not expecting the question. "Well, he's just sitting there. But look at him. He's up to no good, I'm sure of it." The younger officer exchanged a glance with his partner, who let out a quiet sigh. It wasn't the first time they'd dealt with calls like this, and it wouldn't be the last. The older officer walked over to Mike, his steps deliberate but non-threatening. "Hey there, sir. Mind if we have a quick chat?" Mike nodded. "Of course, officer. What's this about?" As the conversation unfolded, the officers began to piece together the truth. They listened to Mike's story, his years of service, the struggles he faced after returning home, and how he ended up here in this moment. The younger officer's expression softened, and even the older officer, who had seen it all, seemed moved. Karen, however, grew impatient. "Why are we even talking to him? Just make him leave. He's trespassing or something, isn't he?" The older officer turned to Karen, his tone measured but firm. "Ma'am, sitting on a public bench isn't a crime. And based on what I've heard, this man hasn't done anything wrong." Karen's face flushed with anger. "Are you serious? You're just going to let him stay? This is outrageous." The younger officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, it's not against the law to be homeless. And frankly, I think it's admirable that someone who's faced so much is still holding his head high. But the story doesn't end here. Just when it seemed like the situation was resolved, The officers did something that left everyone speechless, including Mike and Karen. It was a moment no one in the crowd would forget, a moment that would challenge assumptions, spark conversations, and shine a light on the humanity we too often overlook. What did they do? Stay tuned to find out. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue over the busy downtown streets. It was just another day for most people, the hurried rhythm of life carrying on as usual. But for Mike, a former U.S. Army veteran, today was another battle in a different kind of war. Sitting quietly on the edge of a park bench, Mike clutched his faded backpack, the only possession he had left in the world. His weary eyes scanned the faces of passers-by, some of whom offered sympathetic glances, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Life hadn't been kind to Mike lately, but his spirit remained unbroken. Unbeknownst to Mike, across the street, someone else was watching him too. Her name was Karen. To the outside world, Karen appeared like an average suburban mom, the type who lived for book clubs, PTA meetings, and neighborhood gossip. But Karen had a way of finding problems where none existed, and today, her sharp gaze landed squarely on Mike. She whispered to her friend, gesturing dramatically toward him. "I'm calling the police. He shouldn't be here," Karen said, her voice tinged with a mix of disdain and self-righteousness. "People like him make the neighborhood unsafe." Her friend looked uncomfortable but didn't protest. Karen pulled out her phone and began dialing, her voice growing louder for everyone around to hear. "Yes, officer. There's a suspicious man loitering near the park. He looks dangerous." Dangerous? Mike was about as far from dangerous as anyone could get. A kind-hearted soul who had once served his country with honor, he now found himself misunderstood and overlooked by the society he had fought to protect. But Karen wasn't interested in understanding. To her, he didn't belong. The sound of approaching sirens broke through the ambient noise of the city, turning heads and drawing curious onlookers. Karen stood tall, a smug expression on her face, certain she had done the right thing. Mike, however, remained seated, his expression calm yet cautious. He had been through worse than this and knew better than to panic. Still, his heart raced. Encounters with the police could go in any direction, and he'd learned long ago that life didn't always play fair. The patrol car pulled up to the curb, and two officers stepped out. They were a study in contrasts. One older with a face weathered by years of experience, and the other younger, carrying himself with the eager energy of someone still new to the job. As they approached, Karen wasted no time inserting herself into the situation. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she began, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "I've seen him here for days, and it's making everyone uncomfortable. Who knows what he's planning?" The older officer raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He glanced at Mike, then back at Karen. "Ma'am, can you point out what exactly he's doing that's threatening?" Karen faltered for a moment, clearly not expecting the question. "Well, he's just sitting there. But look at him. He's up to no good, I'm sure of it." The younger officer exchanged a glance with his partner, who let out a quiet sigh. It wasn't the first time they'd dealt with calls like this, and it wouldn't be the last. The older officer walked over to Mike, his steps deliberate but non-threatening. "Hey there, sir. Mind if we have a quick chat?" Mike nodded. "Of course, officer. What's this about?" As the conversation unfolded, the officers began to piece together the truth. They listened to Mike's story, his years of service, the struggles he faced after returning home, and how he ended up here in this moment. The younger officer's expression softened, and even the older officer, who had seen it all, seemed moved. Karen, however, grew impatient. "Why are you even talking to him? Just make him leave. He's trespassing or something, isn't he?" The older officer turned to Karen, his tone measured but firm. "Ma'am, sitting on a public bench isn't a crime. And based on what I've heard, this man hasn't done anything wrong." Karen's face flushed with anger. "Are you serious? You're just going to let him stay? This is outrageous. The younger officer stepped forward. Ma'am, it's not against the law to be homeless. And frankly, I think it's admirable that someone who's faced so much is still holding his head high. But the story doesn't end here. Just when it seemed like the situation was resolved, the officers did something that left everyone speechless, including Mike and Karen. It was a moment no one in the crowd would forget, a moment that would challenge assumptions, spark conversations, and shine a light on the humanity we too often overlook. What did they do? Stay tuned to find out. As the officers stepped back from Mike, their attention turned briefly to Karen, whose indignation was bubbling over. This is ridiculous. He's clearly up to something. Are you seriously just going to ignore that? The older officer adjusted his hat and gave her a long, steady look. Ma'am, we're doing our job, and I suggest you take a moment to think about the assumptions you're making. His words weren't angry, but they were pointed enough to silence Karen for the moment. She crossed her arms, fuming, as the crowd that had started to gather watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Meanwhile, Mike sat quietly, his gaze dropping to his hands. His fingers brushed over the patches sewn onto his backpack, faded emblems of his military service, badges of a life he once lived with pride. The officers had noticed them too. The younger officer leaned down slightly to meet Mike's eye level. You said you served. What branch? Mike's voice was steady but quiet. Army. Did a couple of tours overseas. Been out for a while now. The younger officer nodded, his respect evident. Thank you for your service. My brother's in the army too. Tough work. The older officer chimed in, his tone softening. I've got a nephew who served. Came back and had a hard time adjusting. It's not easy, is it? Mike shook his head. Not easy at all. But you just keep going, right? As they spoke, the tension in the air began to shift. Karen's protests grew quieter, drowned out by the sincerity of the exchange. The officers weren't just addressing the situation. They were acknowledging Mike's humanity, something he hadn't felt in a long time. But then something unexpected happened. The older officer stood up straight and turned to the patrol car. Wait here a minute, he said to both Mike and Karen. The younger officer followed him, and the two spoke quietly near the vehicle, their gestures animated but not aggressive. The crowd murmured, trying to guess what might happen next. Karen's impatience got the better of her. What are they doing? They should be removing him, not whatever this is, she hissed, directing her frustration at no one in particular. But the officers weren't removing anyone. When they returned, the older officer held something in his hand, a piece of paper. He handed it to Mike. Look, we can't solve everything today, but there's a shelter nearby that works with vets. They've got programs, resources. They might be able to help you get back on your feet. Mike blinked, his surprise evident. Really? The younger officer smiled. Yeah. And if you need a ride, we can take you over there. It's not far. Karen's jaw dropped. You've got to be kidding me. You're helping him now. This is absurd. The older officer's expression hardened just slightly. Ma'am, sometimes helping someone is the right thing to do. Maybe you should try it sometime. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, this time with approval. Karen's outrage had lost its steam, and she seemed to realize that her audience wasn't on her side. She turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering under her breath. As for Mike, he hesitated for a moment before accepting the offer. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. I didn't expect this. The older officer patted him on the shoulder. Sometimes, life surprises you. Let's get you some help. The shelter came into view, a modest building tucked between towering office complexes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mike's heart raced as the patrol car slowed to a stop. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt a glimmer of hope, and yet here he was, standing on the edge of something that might finally break the cycle he'd been trapped in for years. The younger officer helped Mike out of the car and handed him his backpack. "You're going to be okay," he said with a smile. "These folks here know what they're doing. Give it a shot." Mike nodded, gripping the strap of his backpack tightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." As the officers returned to their car, Mike stood at the entrance, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't sure if he should knock or just walk in. The decision was made for him when the door opened, and a woman in her late 30s stepped out, holding a clipboard. She had kind eyes and a warm smile that instantly put him at ease. "Hi there," she said. "I'm Angela. Welcome to Haven House. Let's get you inside." Mike followed her through the door, the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filling the air. The lobby was simple but welcoming, with comfortable chairs and a bulletin board covered in flyers for job training programs and counseling services. Angela led him to a small office and gestured for him to sit. "Tell me a bit about yourself," she began, her tone gentle but professional. "How can we help you?" Mike hesitated, unsure of how much to share. He started with the basics: his military service, his struggles after returning home, and how he ended up living on the streets. Angela listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, but never interrupting. When he finished, she leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "You've been through a lot," she said. "But you're here now, and that's a big step. We're going to help you, Mike. You're not alone anymore." For the first time in years, Mike felt a lump rise in his throat. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Meanwhile, back at the park, Karen was still fuming. She couldn't believe how the situation had unfolded. The officer's decision to help Mike instead of removing him felt like a personal insult, and she was determined to do something about it. She called a few neighbors, rallying them with exaggerated tales of how the homeless man had been a threat to their community. Her words were met with mixed reactions. Some shared her concern, while others pointed out that the officer's actions had been compassionate and just. Karen's frustration only grew when she learned that someone had recorded the entire incident and posted it online. Within hours, the video began circulating on social media, drawing thousands of views and an outpouring of support for Mike. Comments flooded in, praising the officers for their empathy and condemning Karen's behavior. She became the unwitting villain of the story, dubbed Racist Karen by commenters who were quick to call out her actions. Unaware of the growing backlash, Karen doubled down on her efforts to clean up the neighborhood. She contacted the local homeowners association, pushing for stricter regulations on loitering and public gatherings. Her actions sparked heated debates during community meetings, with some residents siding with her and others advocating for more inclusive and supportive measures. At the same time, the video's viral nature brought attention to the broader issue of homelessness among veterans. Local news outlets picked up the story, highlighting Mike's journey and the challenges faced by those like him. Advocacy groups and nonprofit organizations reached out, offering resources and support not only to Mike but to the shelter as well. Haven House saw an influx of donations, volunteers, and media inquiries, all eager to be part of the solution. Mike, however, remained unaware of the attention his story was receiving. At Haven House, he focused on taking small steps toward rebuilding his life. He attended counseling sessions, participated in job readiness workshops, and slowly began to open up to others at the shelter. One evening, while helping clean the communal kitchen, he struck up a conversation with a fellow resident named Carla, a single mother who had fled an abusive relationship. Their shared experiences created an instant bond, and they began supporting each other in their respective journeys. As Mike's confidence grew, he started venturing out into the city, applying for jobs and reconnecting with old acquaintances. One day, he ran into an old army buddy, Jake, who was shocked to see him. Jake had built a successful career in construction and immediately offered Mike a job. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and Mike accepted without hesitation. But just as things seemed to be looking up, Karen's relentless campaign took a darker turn. She began circulating petitions to have Haven House relocated, arguing that its presence was attracting undesirables to the neighborhood. Her efforts caught the attention of local officials, who scheduled a public hearing to address the matter. The hearing became a flashpoint for the community, drawing supporters and detractors alike. Mike found himself at the center of the debate, his story used as both an example of the shelter's success and a target for those who opposed it. The tension in the room was palpable as speakers took turns at the microphone, each passionately defending their position. When it was Mike's turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced at Angela, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and began to tell his story, not just of hardship, but of resilience and the transformative power of kindness. His words silenced the room, drawing tears from some and uncomfortable shifting from others. Even Karen, sitting stiffly in the front row, couldn't hide the flicker of doubt that crossed her face. As Mike finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. The hearing ended with no immediate resolution, but the tide seemed to be turning. Karen's influence waned as more people rallied around Haven House and its mission. The shelter's staff and residents continued to fight for their place in the community, refusing to let prejudice and fear dictate their future. Back at the shelter that evening, Mike sat in the common room, reflecting on the day's events. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. He looked around at the people who had become his second family, their faces filled with hope and determination. They had a long road ahead, but they would face it together. The days leading up to the decision on Haven House were marked by tension that gripped the entire community. Karen had doubled down on her efforts, organizing a protest outside the shelter. Signs with bold slogans like "Protect Our Neighborhood" and "Say No to Haven House" were held high, their stark messages visible to everyone who passed by. The protest attracted local media, amplifying Karen's voice and further dividing the community. Inside Haven House, the atmosphere was a mix of resilience and unease. Angela worked tirelessly to reassure the residents, holding meetings to update them on the situation and encourage them to stay strong. Mike, now a central figure in the debate, found himself caught between two worlds. While he was grateful for the support he'd received, the constant scrutiny and pressure weighed heavily on him. The media's attention brought out both the best and worst in people, with some strangers sending messages of encouragement, while others hurled insults and accusations. Late one evening, as the shelter settled into an uneasy quiet, Mike found himself pacing in the small courtyard. Carla joined him, her presence a comforting reminder that he wasn't alone. They talked about the upcoming hearing, their voices low but steady. "You've got to speak again, Mike," Carla urged. "People listen to you. You make them see the human side of all this." Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of pressure again. What if I mess up? What if it doesn't change anything?" "You've already changed so much," Carla said firmly. "Look at all the people standing up for us now. That's because of you. Don't let Karen win." Her words stayed with him as the day of the final hearing arrived. The community center where it was being held was packed, with people spilling out into the hallways. Tension crackled in the air, every seat filled with residents, reporters, and curious onlookers. Karen sat near the front, her expression steely, surrounded by a handful of supporters. Angela, Mike, and several other residents of Haven House took their places on the opposite side, a united front against the opposition. The hearing began with opening statements from the local officials, who laid out the facts of the case. Then came the testimonies. Karen's group spoke first, painting a picture of a community under siege. They described incidents, some real, some exaggerated, that they claimed were linked to Haven House. Karen herself spoke passionately, her words carefully chosen to sound concerned rather than hateful. But underneath her polished delivery, there was an undercurrent of fear and resentment that was hard to ignore. When it was Angela's turn to speak, she stood with quiet confidence. She detailed the work Haven House had done, not just for Mike, but for dozens of others who had passed through its doors. She shared stories of resilience and redemption, her words weaving a narrative of hope that resonated deeply with many in the room. The crowd's mood began to shift, the murmurs of support growing louder. Finally, it was Mike's turn. As he approached the microphone, the room fell silent. He could feel every eye on him, the weight of their expectations pressing down like a physical force. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable emotion behind every word. He talked about his time in the military, the struggles he faced after returning home, and how Haven House had given him a chance to rebuild his life. He spoke of the friends he'd made there, people who were more than their circumstances, people who deserved a second chance. "I'm not asking you to ignore the problems in our community," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm asking you to see us as people. People who are trying to do better, to be better. Haven House isn't the problem. It's part of the solution." His words hung in the air, met first by silence, and then by applause that swelled to fill the room. Even some of Karen's supporters seemed moved, their rigid expressions softening as they clapped hesitantly. Karen herself sat stiffly, her jaw clenched, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. As the hearing continued, the tension only grew. Each side presented its arguments with increasing fervor, the divide between them seeming insurmountable. Outside the community center, a crowd had gathered, a mix of protesters and supporters holding signs and chanting slogans. The media's cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the drama to an even wider audience. Inside, the officials deliberated, their hushed voices adding to the mounting suspense. Angela, Mike, and the rest of the Haven House residents waited anxiously, their hopes and fears intertwined. This decision would determine not just the shelter's fate, but the course of their lives. As the clock ticked on, the atmosphere grew almost unbearable. People whispered among themselves, speculating about the outcome. Mike sat with his hands clasped tightly, his mind racing. He thought about everything that had led him to this moment, the struggles, the small victories, the people who had stood by him. He thought about Carla's words and the responsibility he felt to fight for not just himself, but everyone who called Haven House home. Finally, the officials returned, their expressions unreadable. The room fell silent once more, the anticipation so thick it was almost suffocating. As one of the officials began to speak, every person in the room leaned forward, hanging on his every word, the tension reaching its peak. As the official began to speak, the room was so silent that the faint hum of the overhead lights could be heard. The words that followed were measured and deliberate, outlining the findings of the council's review. They acknowledged the valid concerns raised by both sides and emphasized the importance of fostering a solution that benefited the entire community. But before delivering the final decision, the official paused, as though the weight of the moment needed to settle. Before the announcement could be made, the double doors at the back of the room swung open with a loud creak. Heads turned in unison as a man in a sharp suit entered, flanked by two others carrying files and briefcases. It was evident from their composed yet authoritative demeanor that they weren't ordinary attendees. Angela's face paled as she recognized the emblem on the man's lapel, a symbol from the Regional Housing Authority. Whispers rippled through the room, speculation spreading like wildfire. "Excuse the interruption," the man said, his voice carrying an air of authority. "I'm Robert Jennings, Director of Community Development for the county. We've been made aware of the situation here and felt it necessary to review some information that might impact this decision." Angela's heart sank. While she had fought hard to keep Haven House running, she was acutely aware of the shelter's tenuous standing. Any misstep in compliance or paperwork could spell disaster. Karen, however, looked almost gleeful, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. This was the twist she hadn't expected, but was more than willing to exploit. Jennings' team distributed documents to the officials and began outlining their findings. While they acknowledged the positive testimonials and success stories tied to Haven House, they also highlighted instances of insufficient record-keeping and minor zoning violations. Angela tried to remain composed, but the mounting accusations felt like a barrage, each one chipping away at her confidence. Mike watched the exchange with a sinking feeling. This was no longer just a battle of opinions. It was a bureaucratic assault that threatened to unravel everything he and the other residents had worked toward. He exchanged a glance with Carla, whose expression mirrored his own worry. The stakes had just been raised to a level none of them had anticipated. But then something unexpected happened. A woman stood up from the audience, her presence commanding immediate attention. She was older, dressed modestly, but with an air of quiet dignity. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the room. "I believe I have something to add." Jennings hesitated, clearly thrown off by the interruption. "And you are?" "My name is Evelyn Carter," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm the founder of the original Haven House." A murmur spread through the crowd. Angela's eyes widened in shock, and even Karen looked momentarily unsettled. Evelyn continued, her tone unwavering. "I started this shelter over 30 years ago, before it even had a name. Back then, it was just a safe space for anyone who needed help. I've seen it grow, evolve, and yes, struggle. But what I've seen most of all is the lives it's saved and the hope it's restored." Evelyn's words carried the weight of history and experience, cutting through the tension in the room. She went on to recount stories of individuals who had turned their lives around because of Haven House, painting a vivid picture of its impact that no zoning violation could overshadow. Her testimony was powerful, but it wasn't without risk. Jennings listened intently, occasionally making notes, while Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. As Evelyn spoke, Mike felt a spark of determination reignite within him. This wasn't just about bureaucratic hurdles or community disputes. It was about people, real, flawed, struggling people, and the chance for a better future. He realized then that the fight wasn't over, and he couldn't let fear or doubt hold him back. But the tension in the room only escalated as Jennings' team rebutted Evelyn's points with cold, hard data. They cited statistics and regulations, painting a picture of a shelter that, while noble in purpose, was a liability in execution. Angela's attempts to counter their claims were met with polite but firm resistance. The officials looked increasingly torn, their expressions betraying the difficulty of the decision they faced. Then, as if the situation couldn't grow more intense, a member of the audience stood up, a man none of them recognized. He introduced himself as a journalist who had been investigating local housing policies and claimed to have uncovered evidence suggesting Karen's campaign was tied to a developer seeking to buy the land Haven House occupied. The room erupted in gasps and whispers, the revelation adding a new layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red, her composure cracking for the first time. She stammered out a denial, but the journalist's accusations carried weight, especially when he produced documents that seemed to support his claims. The officials' expressions shifted, their earlier sympathy for Karen's concerns replaced with suspicion. The hearing descended into chaos, with voices overlapping and emotions running high. Angela seized the moment to call for calm, her voice rising above the noise. "We need to focus on what matters here," she said firmly. "This isn't about politics or personal agendas. It's about people who deserve a chance to rebuild their lives." Her words resonated, quieting the room once more. But the conflict was far from over. With the stakes higher than ever and new twists complicating the narrative, it was clear that the fight for Haven House was about more than just a shelter. It was a battle for the soul of the community, and everyone in the room would have to confront where they stood. The roar of the storm outside mirrored the chaos inside Olivia's mind as she stood at the edge of the cliff, the ancient artifact glowing faintly in her trembling hands. The wind whipped her hair, and the shadows cast by the moonlight seemed to dance around her like restless spirits. Behind her, Lucas shouted, his voice breaking through the howling gale. "Olivia, don't do this. You don't know what it'll unleash." She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with a mix of determination and regret. "This is the only way to stop it, Lucas. You saw what it did to everyone else. If I destroy this now, we can end the cycle for good." The artifact pulsed brighter, its eerie hum growing louder, as if resisting her intent. Memories of everything they had endured flashed before her. The betrayal of their closest ally, the riddles left by her late grandfather, the relentless pursuit of a force neither of them fully understood. Every clue had led them here, to this moment. But then Lucas stepped forward, his expression softening. "There's another way. You don't have to sacrifice yourself." Olivia hesitated, the glow of the artifact flickering slightly. "You don't understand. This thing feeds off power, off life. If I don't destroy it completely, it'll find a way to come back, and the world will pay the price." Just as she raised the artifact over the cliff's edge, a sharp laugh cut through the air. Out of the shadows emerged Evelyn, their supposed ally who had vanished weeks ago. She clapped slowly, her smile cold. "Bravo, Olivia. I almost believed your little martyr act," Evelyn sneered. "But you've got it all wrong. Destroying it won't stop anything. It'll only make things worse." Both Olivia and Lucas froze, their eyes darting between Evelyn and the artifact. Evelyn stepped closer, her tone dripping with mockery. "That artifact isn't the key to ending this. It's the key to controlling it. And you, my dear, were just a pawn to bring it here." Olivia's heart sank as realization hit her like a thunderclap. The riddles, the danger, even Evelyn's disappearance, it had all been orchestrated. She had played right into their enemies' hands. Lucas lunged at Evelyn, but she was faster, pulling a small device from her pocket and pressing a button. Instantly, the artifact flared with blinding light, and Olivia felt a searing heat course through her veins. The energy inside it was no longer contained. It was surging into her. "Olivia!" Lucas shouted, shielding his eyes from the glare. Evelyn laughed again. "Congratulations. You've just become the vessel." Pain and power warred within Olivia as the artifact fused with her being. She could feel its ancient force trying to take control, whispering promises of strength, dominion, and eternal life. But beneath the chaos, a spark of clarity remained, her will. Gritting her teeth, Olivia focused every ounce of her strength on pushing back against the force. She thought of Lucas, of the people they had lost, of the world that would suffer if she failed. The artifact's hum grew deafening, but Olivia's voice cut through. "No, I am not your puppet." The light around her shifted, growing softer, warmer. Evelyn's smug expression faltered, replaced by confusion and fear. "What are you doing? That power isn't meant for you." Olivia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. "It's not your power either, and it's time to end this." In a final burst of light, the artifact shattered, its energy dissipating into the night. Evelyn screamed as the shockwave knocked her off her feet, the device sparking uselessly. Lucas rushed to catch Olivia as she collapsed, her body limp but alive. As the storm began to fade, Olivia opened her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "It's over." But just as Lucas started to smile, the ground beneath them trembled. In the distance, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. Another artifact, pulsing in perfect rhythm. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick with the scent of rain and the hum of life returning to normal. The once chaotic scene now seemed eerily quiet. People gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones as they pieced together what had just happened. The tension that had gripped everyone slowly gave way to relief, and for some, a profound sense of gratitude. Mia stood near the edge of the clearing, her heart still racing. She hadn't anticipated how everything would unfold, and the weight of what had been at stake leaned heavily on her mind. She looked over at Ethan, who was leaning against a tree, catching his breath. His shirt was torn, dirt streaked his face, but his eyes held a calmness that reassured her. "We did it," he said, his voice steady but low. "I wasn't sure we would, but here we are." Mia nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The sunlight was breaking through the clouds, casting golden rays over the landscape. It felt symbolic, like a reminder that even after the darkest of nights, the light would find its way back. "You think it's over?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ethan pushed off the tree and walked closer. "For now," he said. "But we both know things like this don't stay buried for long. The question is, what do we do next?" Mia's mind raced through everything they had learned. The secrets they had uncovered, the truths that had been hidden for so long. It was tempting to think they could walk away now, leave it all behind, and go back to their lives. But deep down, she knew they couldn't. Not entirely. "We make sure this doesn't happen again," she said, her voice firm. "We've come too far to just let it all fall apart. If we don't keep pushing for change, who will?" Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. It's not enough to survive. We have to make sure what we've done actually means something." As they spoke, others began to approach. Some faces were familiar, allies they'd found along the way, while others were strangers, people who had been impacted by the same forces they had been fighting against. There was an unspoken understanding among them, a bond formed by shared struggles and victories. An older woman stepped forward, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun. She held a small notebook in her hands, the edges worn and the pages filled with careful handwriting. "You'll need this," she said, handing it to Mia. "It's everything I know, everything I've seen. Use it wisely." Mia accepted the notebook with a nod of gratitude. She didn't have to ask how the woman had come by this information or what it had cost her. The weight of the notebook in her hands felt like both a gift and a responsibility. The group dispersed slowly, each person returning to their lives, but carrying with them the shared memory of what they'd faced together. Mia and Ethan lingered for a while longer, watching as the clearing emptied out. "What now?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but curious. "Do we go back to pretending none of this happened?" Mia shook her head. "No. We build something better, something that lasts." They didn't have all the answers yet, but they had each other and the determination to make a difference. It was enough to start with. Together, they began walking back toward the town, their steps purposeful despite the exhaustion that tugged at their bodies. In the days that followed, the ripples of their actions began to spread. People started asking questions, demanding accountability from those in power. The quiet whispers of change grew louder, becoming a chorus that couldn't be ignored. Mia and Ethan found themselves at the center of it all, not because they sought recognition, but because their resolve inspired others to join them. There were setbacks, of course, moments when it felt like they were fighting a losing battle. But each time, they reminded themselves of why they had started this journey. They leaned on each other and the community that had formed around them. And slowly, steadily, progress was made. Months later, as the first signs of winter appeared, Mia stood on the steps of the town hall, addressing a crowd that had gathered despite the chill in the air. Her voice was strong, her words filled with conviction. She spoke of unity, of resilience, and of the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. Ethan stood beside her, offering quiet support as always. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. It echoed through the streets, a sound that carried hope and determination. Mia felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, knowing there was still work to be done. As the crowd began to disperse, Ethan turned to her with a small smile. "You did good up there," he said. Mia smiled back. "We did good. This was never just about me." He nodded, and for a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the town come alive with renewed purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was all you needed. Later that evening, as they walked home together under a sky full of stars, Mia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't scare her. She knew they'd face whatever came their way, together.